Imagine, for just a second, the most famous murder in human history.
Right, the very first one ever recorded.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you grew up anywhere near Western culture, you probably know the rough sketch of the story,
Oh,
right?
for sure. Two brothers in a field.
Right. A field, two brothers, a terrible act of jealousy over rejected sacrifice, and, well, this permanent bloody stain on the human soul.
That's a classic Sunday school version, yeah.
But so what if you were told that it wasn't a biological murder at all?
Which is a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. Like, what if there was no literal corpse in the dirt? What if that violent act was actually this massive world-altering metaphor for the violent birth of human civilization itself?
It completely upends everything we think we know about our own origin story.
Totally.
Because when you look at the text from this new perspective, it takes a narrative of individual sin, and transforms it into this highly complex psychological and sociological blueprint for the entire trajectory of our species.
So it stops being a simple morality tale.
Exactly. It stops being a morality tale and starts being an anthropological record.
And that is exactly what we are digging into today. We've got our hands on a really fascinating document titled Religion in the Gray Area, Part 1.
It's a dense one, too.
Oh, heavily dense. But before we really get into the weeds here, we need to be incredibly clear with you, the listener. We are looking at some pretty radical reinterpretations of foundational religious texts today.
Very radical.
Yeah, so to be clear, we aren't taking sides or endorsing this as absolute historical truth. We certainly aren't here to, challenge anyone's personal theology.
Right. They're just analyzing the text.
Exactly. Our mission is simply to explore the theories presented in this document and see the ancient world through its totally unique and, frankly, completely mind-bending lens.
And it is a deeply layered framework. I mean, to truly grasp the magnitude of the era this document is discussing, the author argues we have to look at the past through what they call a trifocal lens.
A trifocal lens. Okay, break that down for me.
So if you only use one lens, say, just reading the text, literally you miss the bigger picture. To understand this pre-flood world, we need to constantly shift between three specific perspectives.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, there's the metaphorical lens, which involves a total deconstruction and, rethinking of the book of Genesis.
Got it. And the second?
Second is the Sumerian or theological lens. That's where we connect the dots between overlapping ancient Mesopotamian mythologies to find the core data.
Right. Looking at the older cultures.
Exactly. And third, the geological lens. This grounds the entire sprawling epic in a very real, scientifically verifiable cataclysmic ice age.
The Younger Dryas, right?
Yes, the Younger Dryas.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with that first lens, the metaphorical. Because the text argues that to understand the modern world, we have to deconstruct the story of Cain and Abel.
We do.
But logically, to even get to the brothers, we have to reevaluate their parents, right? We have to reevaluate Eden.
Right, you have to start at the beginning.
Because this framework suggests Adam and Eve were not your standard domestic nuclear family living in some botanical paradise.
Far from it, actually. The document posits that Adam and Eve should be viewed as, quote, original creators.
Original creators, okay.
Yeah. They were biological vessels or prototypes. And to understand what that means, you have to think about the psychology of a being that has absolutely no concept of childhood.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that.
Right. Because they didn't grow up. They didn't have parents of their own to model behavior after. They had zero sociological scaffolding.
Because they just appeared, basically.
Exactly. They were created fully formed, and they were tasked with transitioning abstract thought into physical form.
So we're talking about a human brain with immense operational capability, but zero lived experience.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like pure, raw processing power, without the empathy or the context that you develop by, being a kid and scraping your knee or relying on a parent.
Yes, exactly. And if they are these raw prototypes, then Eden itself couldn't just be a geographical garden with nice fruit trees and a babbling brook. It has to be something else entirely.
Right. So what does the text say Eden actually is?
Well, under this metaphorical lens, Eden is described as a heavenly frequency or a specific state of being.
A frequency, like a vibration.
Kind of, yeah. It was an environment, maybe conceptual, maybe dimensional, where there was absolutely no division between the physical world and divine intent.
Okay, so no friction.
None at all. Everything was provided, and the prototypes were perfectly connected to the source of their creation.
I'm really trying to wrap my head around that. It's almost like viewing Eden as a highly advanced scientific incubator rather than a pastoral park, you know?
Yes, an incubator is a perfect analogy.
It's like this perfectly controlled, frictionless environment designed specifically for a new species to exist in before they're exposed to the harsh
Yep,
elements.
exactly. It's a protected state.
But that immediately makes me wonder, if Eden is a state of being, a frequency of pure connection, then what is the fall?
Oh, yeah.
Because if it's not literally a woman biting into a piece of fruit on the advice of a talking snake, what actually happened to break that frequency?
Well, the author builds the case that stepping out of Eden was humanity's fundamental shift into a fragmented physical reality.
Okay.
It was the descent from a unified divine collective into dualistic thought.
Dualistic thought, meaning like me versus you, us versus nature.
Precisely. You go from a state where everything is provided and perfectly connected
Yeah.
into a harsh, dense physical dimension, and suddenly survival requires labor. It requires separation, hoarding, and ultimately conflict.
So the fall is essentially the birth of the human ego.
Yes, the birth of the ego.
Yeah.
And that ego-driven conflict immediately manifests in the very next generation.
Right. Which brings us to the brothers, Abel and Cain.
Here we go.
The text paints them not just as two guys with different day jobs who didn't get along, but as the literal embodiment of two entirely different eras of human development, right? Just clashing against each other.
That's the core of the metaphorical lens, yes.
So Abel is the shepherd. He represents the nomadic, pastoral way of life. And if you think about a nomadic shepherd, his entire existence is based on a spiritual reliance on nature.
He moves with the seasons.
Yeah, he trusts that the earth, the rain, and the divine will provide grass for his flock. He's basically constantly looking up.
He is. And in stark contrast, you have Cain, the tiller.
The farmer.
Right. Cain represents human agency, early agriculture, and permanent settlement. He isn't looking up at the sky, trusting the weather. He's looking down at the dirt, figuring out how to control it.
He's trying to master his environment.
Exactly. Cain is the ego, manipulating the earth to force it to produce on his schedule. He represents that drive to build fences, to claim ownership of a patch of land, to control the environment rather than just peacefully live within its natural rhythms.
And then we get to the offerings, the really famous breaking point in the story.
Yes, the sacrifice.
So Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, blood and fat. Cain brings the fruit of the ground vegetation. Now, historically, if you go to a Sunday school, you're taught that Cain's offering was rejected because it wasn't a blood sacrifice, right?
Right, or that he was secretly holding back the good stuff and his heart wasn't in it.
Yeah, exactly. But this document points out something historically crucial. In the ancient Near East, grain offerings were completely acceptable.
They were incredibly common. We see them all over ancient traditions.
Right,
But-
so neither of these were meant to be a sin offering where blood was strictly required. So the conflict wasn't about a moral failing on Cain's part at all.
That's a really critical distinction the author makes. The text refers to this moment not as a moral test, but as evolutionary friction.
Evolutionary friction. I love that term.
It makes a lot of sense. Both offerings were valid, perfect representations of their respective lifestyles. The tension wasn't that Cain was inherently evil and Abel was inherently good.
Right. It wasn't a good guy, bad guy situation.
No, the tension was that these two modes of human existence, nomadic harmony with nature versus sedentary manipulation of nature, they just cannot coexist forever in the same space.
Because one fundamentally disrupts the other.
Exactly. To have agriculture, you have to fence off the land. But to be a nomad, you need open land for your flocks to graze. One has to give way to the other for complex civilization to arise.
Okay, let me stop you right there because this completely reframes the most famous part of the story.
It really does.
If the conflict is just this unavoidable evolutionary friction between foraging and farming, then the murder of Abel isn't a literal act of fratricide.
No, there isn't a guy bleeding out in a wheat field.
Wow. It is the systemic, necessary killing of the obsolete nomadic lifestyle to make way for permanent, structured civilization.
You nailed it. It's the human ego permanently eclipsing the spirit.
That is just a profound shift in interpretation.
The argument here is that in order to build the very first cities, the wandering pastoral lifestyle represented by Abel had to be metaphorically slain.
Because you just can't build a city if you're constantly moving.
Right. You cannot build megalithic structures develop complex irrigation, and create a surplus of food if your population is constantly packing up their tents and following the reindeer herds.
So the murder is the death of humanity's primitive innocence.
Yes. It's our species permanently trading nomadic freedom for the structured, heavy, demanding, and honestly often violent stability of civilization.
Okay, if we follow that logic, it explains the aftermath of the murder, which has honestly always been a massive theological sticking point for a lot of people.
The banishment, right?
Yeah, because if Cain commits a literal, cold-blooded murder of the only other young guy on Earth, God's reaction is baffling.
It doesn't make sense if you read it literally.
No. Cain commits the ultimate crime, and instead of striking him down, God protects him. He gives him the mark of Cain and banishes him to the land of Nod, which, if I remember correctly, translates to wandering.
It does.
So why reward a murderer with divine protection?
Because under this gray framework, God doesn't kill Cain for the simple reason that you cannot kill a fundamental, necessary part of the human psyche.
Ah, okay.
Cain isn't just a murderer here. He is the catalyst. He represents the new, inevitable direction of the human species.
So God is preserving the future.
By protecting Cain, the divine force is preserving the only remaining human branch capable of surviving what is about to happen to the planet.
And the banishment to Nod.
That isn't a prison sentence. It's just the reality of displacement. It's the natural, unavoidable result of falling into a lower vibration of existence.
Because you can't be in the incubator anymore.
Exactly. Once the ego takes over, once humanity starts building, hoarding, and manipulating the earth, you can never go back to that heavenly Eden state. You are destined to wander in the heavy physical world.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there and push back on this a bit.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. We just spent 15 minutes establishing that Eden, the prototypes of Adam and Eve, and the conflict between Cain and Abel are metaphors for the sociological shift from foraging to farming, right?
Right.
But when Cain is banished, he complains to God. He says his punishment is greater than he can bear, and he is absolutely terrified that, quote, anyone who finds me will kill me.
Huh. He does say that.
So if this is all a metaphor about the ego, who is he physically afraid of? If Adam, Eve, and Cain are the only humans left in the narrative, who are these literal others outside of Eden? He kind of can't have it both ways. Is this a metaphor or a historical event?
That is exactly why this text is so controversial, and honestly why we have to use the trifocal lens.
Okay.
The author argues that Genesis is a hybrid document. It is a historical event wrapped tightly in a metaphorical scheme.
A hybrid document. Okay.
The presence of these others is one of the most glaring textual anomalies in the book of Genesis. The document uses this anomaly to argue that there were absolutely other pre-existing humans already out there in the wilderness.
Wait, really? Like other Homo sapiens?
Yes. Homo sapiens have been walking the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. These were people who were not made in the Eden image. They were primitive, nomadic, hardened by the elements.
So Cain is stepping into an already populated world.
Exactly. Cain is terrified because the metaphor is crashing into reality. He, as a being of newly awakened ego and divine blueprint, is stepping into a brutal established world populated by tribes that do not share his experimental lineage.
Okay, that makes total sense. So Genesis is focusing on this one specific modified lineage while basically ignoring the rest of the globe's population until they actually intersect.
That's the argument, yes.
So to protect Cain from these wild, pre-existing tribes, God gives him the mark. Now, popular culture always depicts the mark of Cain as like a literal tattoo on his forehead or some curse that makes him look monstrous.
Like a glowing red scar or something.
Yeah, exactly. But this text suggests the mark wasn't a physical brand at all. It was a pre-programmed survival kit.
Yes. Think of the mark not as a magical rune, but as an embedded generational inheritance of observation and architecture.
Like an instinct.
More than an instinct. If Cain is going to be the architect of a completely new world, he cannot spend 10,000 years figuring out the basics of agriculture, geometry, and masonry through trial and error.
Because he would just die. The environment is too harsh.
Exactly. The physical environment he is about to step into is far too hostile for a slow learning curve. The text theorizes that the mark of Cain was a divine download of data.
A divine
An upload of the master blueprint for civilization. It allowed him to completely bypass centuries of failure and immediately start organizing humanity.
Oh man, it's like being the only person who intuitively knows how to build an internal combustion engine in a world where everyone else is still banging rocks together.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Okay, so if Cain was essentially uploaded with this master blueprint for human civilization, he had to build it somewhere. And historically, the earliest massive organized civilizations pop up in Mesopotamia. So, if we want to see if Cain's blueprint actually existed in reality, we have to look at the records those ancient cultures left behind.
We have to look at the dirt beneath the myths.
Exactly, and that requires us to shift lenses.
It does. To trace the physical execution of this blueprint, we have to shift to the Sumerian lens. And doing this requires us to drastically stretch our concept of time.
Stretch it how?
Well, we're moving away from the traditional biblical timeline of a few thousand years, and we're looking at tens of thousands of years of human history.
Okay.
The source document argues that the Sumerian culture, whose deepest roots might stretch all the way back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age, is the true parent civilization.
12,000 years. Wow.
Yeah, and in this view, the book of Genesis is not an original standalone historical account. Genesis is essentially the condensed monotheistic executive summary of a 12,000-year-old Sumerian library.
I love that executive summary analogy. I mean, if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, you know exactly what an executive summary is.
Oh, definitely.
It's taking a sprawling 500-page, multi-volume encyclopedic report full of complex data, competing departments, and messy history, and you just boil it down to a tight 2-page bullet point presentation for a new CEO who just wants the bottom line.
That is exactly what the authors of Genesis were doing.
They took the sprawling polytheism of Sumer and summarized it into a tight narrative about one god. And if you read the original Sumerian texts side by side with Genesis, it becomes basically impossible to unsee.
It really does. Look at the story of Noah and the Great Flood.
Yeah, let's look at that.
Noah is not the original guy with the boat. The Sumerians had a man named Ziusudra in a text called the Eridu Genesis and another figure named Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
And those texts are way older, right?
Much older. These stories predate the biblical Noah by over 1,000 years, maybe much more.
They absolutely do. But what is truly revealing isn't just that the stories share a man, a boat, and a flood. It's the differences in why the flood happened, right?
Yes, the motivation is completely different.
Because in the older Sumerian cuneiform texts, the supreme gods, An and Enlil, they decide to send the flood because humanity has become too noisy.
Literally too loud.
Yeah, the human population has exploded, they are chaotic, and they are literally keeping the gods awake. It is a highly practical, almost bureaucratic decision to just call the herd. It's pest control.
It is entirely practical for the gods.
But when the later Hebrew writers adapted this massive event for their executive summary in Genesis, they reframed the motivation entirely.
Right, they had a different goal.
It was no longer about overpopulation or noise. It was this profound moral judgment on human wickedness and spiritual corruption. They took a story of cosmic bureaucracy and turned it into an ethical lesson.
They filtered it through their new theological lens.
Yeah.
And yet, even with that strict monotheistic filter applied, the old polytheistic roots still bleed through the pages of Genesis.
Because you just can't fully erase 10,000 years of cultural memory.
No, you can't. The document calls these slip-ups linguistic fossils.
Linguistic fossil, I love that. My favorite example is right at the beginning, Genesis 1.26. Let us make man in our image, who is the us.
It's one of the great linguistic mysteries of the text. The word used for God in those early chapters of Genesis is Elohim.
Right.
And grammatically in Hebrew, Elohim is a plural noun. In early Semitic context, it literally translates to the powerful ones. The framework we are exploring argues that this plural pronoun is a lingering linguistic ghost of the Anunnaki Council.
Okay, hold on. Before we jump deeper into linguistic fossils, for those listening who might not be deep into Mesopotamian mythology or, ancient aliens, internet forums, who exactly are the Anunnaki?
Good point. We should clarify that.
Are we talking about a pantheon like the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, or something else entirely?
It's a great question, and we really need to strip away a lot of modern pop culture baggage to understand them. In strict ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki were the tiered assembly of gods.
The assembly.
Anu was the sky god, the supreme ruler, and Ki was the earth goddess. The Anunnaki were their offspring, the princely deities who decreed the fates of humanity.
So they were like a parliament.
Exactly. They operated like a highly structured, almost corporate parliament or divine council, where a high king presided over lesser deities who each had specific jurisdictions, like one was over a city, one over rivers, elements, that sort of thing.
Okay, so going back to Genesis.
Right. The author of our document argues that when Genesis says, "Let us make man," it is an unedited leftover from an older text where Anu was actually addressing the Anunnaki Council.
So the Hebrew authors missed a spot when they were editing.
Exactly. The later Hebrew authors tried to clean up the polytheism to focus on one supreme God, but those plural linguistic fossils remained embedded in the foundation of the text.
That makes total sense when you look at how God physically behaves in the early chapters of Genesis, too.
How do you mean?
Well, if you read later biblical texts, God is this abstract, omnipresent force, right? He is everywhere, all at once, knowing everything. But the God of early Genesis is very physical, very localized, and honestly has blind spots.
That's true.
He literally walks in the cool of the garden and calls out looking for Adam, like he lost him. And later, during the story of the Tower of Babel, the text specifically says the Lord had to go down to see the city and the tower the humans were building.
Right, he had to travel.
He couldn't just see it from everywhere. He acts very much like a localized Sumerian patron deity who has to physically travel to inspect his specific turf or to deal with a rival city-state.
That localized behavior is a direct echo of Sumerian city-state politics. Each major Sumerian city, Uruk, Eridu, had its own patron god from the Anunnaki Council, who actually supposedly lived in the temple at the center of the city.
Which brings up the Tower of Babel, which is a perfect example of this ancient divine politics at play.
It's a fascinating story.
In the standard Sunday school version, why did God confuse the languages at Babel? It's usually taught as a punishment for human pride, right? Humans tried to build a tower to heaven, God got offended and scrambled their languages.
That's the common reading.
But the religion in the gray area text frames it entirely differently. It frames the confusion of tongues as a divine firewall.
A firewall. To understand the firewall, we have to look at what humanity was actually achieving at Babel. Remember the mark of Cain?
The survival kit, the blueprint.
Yes, that divine download, that blueprint for singular, highly efficient civilization. At Babel, that blueprint was working flawlessly.
So they were succeeding.
Wildly succeeding. Humanity was achieving total assimilation and hyper-collaboration. They all spoke one language, they had a unified goal, and they were manipulating the earth on a massive scale. The Divine Council looked at this and realized that if humans continued at this pace, nothing would be impossible for them. By fracturing their communication, introducing different languages, the divine forces were essentially installing a virus into the human operating system.
It's basically divine antitrust legislation.
Ah, that's exactly what it is.
Humanity was acting like a massive, unified global monopoly, pooling all their resources and dominating the physical realm. The Divine Council realized the singular monopoly was a threat to their own hierarchical authority, so they broke humanity up into smaller, competing startups so they wouldn't take over the whole market.
That is a phenomenal modern analogy. Yes, breaking up the monopoly prevented Cain's unified monolith from ever challenging the divine hierarchy again. It was a deliberate strategic control mechanism, not just a petty punishment for building a tall building.
And speaking of divine control mechanisms, we absolutely have to talk about how these ancient texts deal with time.
Yes, the timelines are wild.
Because you read Genesis, and you've got these patriarchs like Methuselah living for 969 years, Adam lives 930 years.
It sounds like pure mythology or fairy tales to our modern ears.
It does. It sounds impossible.
But then you look at the Sumerian king list, which is an actual physical clay prism discovered by archaeologists, and you have pre-flood Sumerian kings reigning for 28,000 years or 36,000 years.
The numbers are astronomical.
It seems absurd until you realize what the authors were actually doing with those numbers.
Exactly. The document calls this manipulation of numbers a chronological shield. We need to stop looking at these extreme lifespans as literal biological ages of single human beings.
Okay, so what are they?
Instead, we should view them as political tools. Think about the geopolitics of ancient Mesopotamia. If you are a king of a city-state and you want absolute, unquestioned authority, what is your best strategy?
You prove you've always been in charge. Yes. You document that your specific lineage, your specific dynasty, stretches back uninterrupted to the dawn of creation. By stretching the reigns of their ancestors across tens of thousands of years, the Sumerians effectively locked the past.
Wow. Who controls the past controls the future.
Exactly.
If a king can prove his great-great-grandfather ruled for 20,000 years, No upstart general can realistically challenge his divine right to the throne.
Precisely. They weaponized time, they controlled history to secure their political immortality in the present.
And Genesis just copied that.
The Hebrew writers of Genesis adopted this exact same stylistic technique for their patriarchs, though they scaled the numbers down from tens of thousands to hundreds, making it slightly more palatable while still establishing an unbroken ancient authority.
Okay, so we have this sprawling polytheistic Sumerian bedrock. We have councils of gods, localized deities, massive lifespans, and divine monopolies. How do we get from that wild, chaotic mythological landscape to the strict, highly structured monotheism of the modern world?
That's the big question.
Because the text points to one specific pivot point in history, a man named Abraham.
Yes, if you read Genesis, chapter 12 is where the great pivot happens.
Okay.
The narrative tone shifts drastically. Suddenly, the text stops talking about global floods, giant Nephilim, ancient cities, and divine councils. The camera zooms way in, and it focuses entirely on the life of one single man and his immediate family.
And before we move on, define Nephilim for us really quickly, because that word gets thrown around a lot.
Sure. In the simplest terms, Genesis 6 describes the Nephilim as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men.
So hybrids.
Yes. In the Sumerian context we've been discussing, these would be interpreted as demigods, the hybrid offspring of the Anunnaki and human women. They were the heroes of old, men of renown.
Yeah.
But after Genesis 11, the text aggressively pivots away from all of that mythological grandiosity.
Right, it zooms in on Abraham. And the text notes that Abraham leaving his home in Ur of the Chaldeans isn't just a physical relocation.
It's much more than that.
Ur was a massive, advanced Sumerian metropolis. It was basically the New York City of the ancient world. So Abraham leaving Ur is a profound narrative divorced from Sumerian polytheism.
He is literally turning his back on the ziggurats.
The stepped pyramids.
Yes, the massive temples where the Sumerian gods supposedly resided. He is walking away from a highly visible, institutionalized religion with hundreds of patron deities to follow a singular voice that has no temple, no statue, and no physical representation.
That must have seemed insane to the people around him.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
And as the narrative of Abraham progresses, the text notes that the many deities are folded into the one.
The consolidation of power.
Exactly. The powerful Anunnaki council members, who used to be temperamental patron gods in their own right, get demoted. In the new monotheistic framework, they are reduced to just being angels, which literally just means messengers. They have no independent power anymore.
But the absolute defining moment of this divorce from the old world is the story of the binding of Isaac.
That is the crucial world-changing break.
Explain that.
You have to understand the historical context Abraham was living in. He was surrounded by Canaanite and Mesopotamian cultures that regularly practiced child sacrifice to appease their temperamental, localized gods.
Which is horrifying.
It was brutal, but it was an accepted reality of the ancient world. So when the God of Abraham demands the sacrifice of his son, Isaac, it seems like business as usual for an ancient deity.
Right. Abraham probably wasn't even entirely surprised.
Probably not. But by stopping the knife at the very last second, a radical new boundary is established.
It was a cosmic bait and switch.
It really was.
It was a loud, declarative statement that the God of Abraham abhors this practice.
Exactly. This moment marks the definitive birth of ethical monotheism. It took a chaotic cosmic drama where humans were just playthings and collateral damage for bickering gods, and replaced it with an ethical history governed by a single, moral, universal landlord who actually cares about human conduct.
If you're listening to this on your commute or, while doing the dishes, you might be thinking, okay, this is a fascinating literary analysis, but what does this actually mean for me? Why does this matter?
Right. What's the real-world application?
Exactly. It matters because it implies that the stories you might have grown up with, the clean, sanitized Sunday school lessons, are layered over actual, cataclysmic, terrifying human history. They are the surviving echoes of a much older, darker world that our ancestors barely survived.
It's an incredible thought.
So let's peel back the mythology entirely. Let's stop looking at ancient scrolls and start looking at the dirt. Let's look at the actual physical earth beneath these stories.
The geological lens.
Yes, because if Cain was a real blueprint and the Sumerians were the ones who wrote down the history, there has to be physical evidence. That brings us to our third and final lens, the geological.
So to truly understand the harsh reality of the world Cain walked into when he was banished from the Eden frequency, we have to establish the environmental reality of that specific era.
Paint us a picture.
We are looking at a period known to geologists and climatologists as the Younger Dryas. This occurred roughly between 10,800 and 9,600 BCE.
Okay, so over 11,000 years ago.
Right. And the physical evidence for this epoch is not found in a book. It is etched directly into the Earth's crust in a geological boundary known as the black mat layer.
And we aren't just talking about a slight chill in the air or a bad winter here.
No, not at all.
The black mat is a distinct geological layer of scorched earth, widespread charcoal, and high concentrations of iridium and platinum. And those are elements that are incredibly rare on Earth, but very common in asteroids and comets.
Exactly.
This layer is found all over the globe, from North America to the Middle East. The leading scientific theory, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, suggests that a fragmented comet entered our atmosphere
And caused absolute devastation.
The resulting impacts, or massive atmospheric air bursts, triggered global, continent-spanning wildfires. The smoke and ash from these fires blocked out the sun, triggering a sudden, violent, and incredibly deep ice age.
It was a true extinction-level event. This is the exact period when the megafauna completely died off.
Megafauna being the giant mammals, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths, the dire wolves, the animals that early humans relied on for massive caloric intake and heavy furs vanished almost overnight.
Ah.
The skies would have been choked with toxic ash. Global temperatures plummeted drastically, not over thousands of years, but within a matter of decades, maybe even years. The lush, forgiving environments of the previous epoch were instantly replaced by a landscape of literal fire and frost.
So, paint that picture in your mind. Go back to our metaphor of Cain. He is banished. The gates of the frictionless Eden frequency close behind him forever. He steps out into a physical world that is absolutely tearing itself apart.
It is an apocalypse.
Freezing ash in the air, the giant animals are dead or dying, and he is surrounded by these desperate, starving bands of primitive, nomadic hunter-gatherers who are watching their entire way of life literally freeze to death.
And this raises a profound question, one which the gray area text highlights brilliantly.
Okay, what's that?
If resources are suddenly scarce and everyone is starving, why didn't these desperate primitive tribes just kill Cain on sight?
Right. I mean, he's a stranger, he's an outsider carrying some sort of curse or mark, and he is walking into their territory during an apocalypse.
In a pure, primitive survival situation, a stranger is just a threat to your limited food supply. Logically, he should have been murdered on day one.
But they don't kill him.
They don't.
And the reason they don't kill him, according to the text, goes back directly to that mark, that embedded, pre-programmed survival kit.
Yes.
Cain didn't just have a target on his back. He had leverage. He carried the agrarian secrets. He was perceived as a figure of displaced divinity. While the hunter-gatherers were panicking because the wild herds were dead and the old ways of foraging were failing, Cain knew how to manipulate the earth.
He had the blueprint.
He knew how to coax food from frozen, resistant soil. He knew the geometry required to build massive stone walls to block the 100-mile-per-hour freezing winds.
He offered them the only thing that mattered in that moment, a radical new strategy for existence.
A way out.
He taught these fractured tribes that they could no longer survive by chasing migrating herds across an ice sheet. They had to stop running. They had to gather together, pool their limited labor, build permanent enclosures, and reshape the environment to suit their needs rather than being victims of it.
Wow.
Cain's exile from Eden maps perfectly onto the exact historical pivot point where the human urban impulse was born out of sheer climatic desperation.
And it wasn't just Cain pulling this off alone either. I love this part of the document because it builds out the roles of his entire family in this desperate survival mission.
A great sociological breakdown.
Right. Genesis gives us a few names, but the text expands on what they actually represent. Cain brings the macrostructure, the broad concepts of agriculture, stone building, the mathematical concept of a wall. But what about his unnamed wife?
She gets overlooked so often.
She's often completely ignored by religious history, but the sociological framework here gives her a vital, indispensable role. If Cain is the muscle and the architect moving 10-ton rocks, his wife is bringing the magic of transformation.
She brings the technology.
She is the one introducing metallurgy and complex textiles.
We have to understand the sociological mechanics of what she represents. It is the microstructure of civilization. You can build a massive stone wall to block the wind, but you will still freeze to death in the Ice Age without tightly woven wool or flax.
Obviously.
You can know how to plant seeds, but you cannot harvest enough wheat to feed 1,000 people if you're using brittle animal bones. You need copper tools.
Right. And think about how metallurgy completely changes the social hierarchy. If you introduce a copper scythe to a primitive tribe, suddenly one person can harvest wheat 10 times faster than before.
Efficiency changes everything.
That means the other 9 people in the tribe don't have to farm anymore. They're freed up to become specialized workers. They can become soldiers to protect the grain, priests to pray for rain, or full-time builders.
A division of labor.
Exactly. The person who controls the forge, who knows how to turn raw rock into a shiny, deadly blade, essentially controls the wealth and the power of that new society.
Exactly. She is the cultural architect turning a desperate, freezing survival camp into a functioning hierarchical society.
And then there's the sun.
And that brings us to their son, Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
The very first city Cain built is named after him. Enoch represents the ultimate institutional shift.
The rules.
Exactly. If Cain brings the walls and his wife brings the tools, Enoch brings the rules. How do you get thousands of traumatized, starving, heavily armed people to live in a high-density area without them murdering each other over food?
You need systems of law.
You need strict social hierarchy. You need record-keeping to know who owns what grain.
It's a complete, unprecedented paradigm shift. What we are looking at isn't the slow, gradual, peaceful, evolutionary climb from cavemen to city dwellers that we usually see in museum dioramas.
No, it's not a gentle progression.
The text argues that the birth of civilization was a violent, desperate burst of absolute genius born from exile and fueled by climate catastrophe. They used the apocalypse of the Younger Dryas to forcefully jumpstart human history.
That is the core thesis. Civilization wasn't a natural progression. It was an emergency protocol.
Okay, let's ground this. If this theory holds any water at all, if Cain's family, armed with this divine download of architectural and sociological knowledge, built a massive megalithic city called Enoch right at the tail end of the Ice Age, in the region described as East of Eden, is there any physical proof?
We need physical stones.
Right. We can talk about metaphors and Sumerian executive summaries and sociological mechanics all day long. But are there any actual physical stones we can point to in the modern world?
There are. And this is where the metaphorical, Sumerian, and geological lenses perfectly, almost terrifyingly, align with modern archaeology.
Where do we look?
To find Cain's city, we have to look at a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe.
Ground zero of the Neolithic Revolution.
Exactly. Göbekli Tepe sits right in the heart of the Fertile Crescent, near the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Wait, those are the rivers of Eden?
Not coincidentally, these are the exact rivers described in the book of Genesis as flowing directly out of Eden. And chronologically, radiocarbon dating places the construction of Göbekli Tepe right around 9,600 BCE, the exact moment the Younger Dryas Ice Age was ending.
And the location perfectly aligns with Cain's specific skill set.
It really does.
Genesis literally calls Cain the very first tiller of the ground. Well, just a few miles away from the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, at a place called Karakada, geneticists have traced the DNA of modern wheat back to its absolute origin.
They found the ancestor of all domestic wheat.
They found the genetic ancestor of the world's very first domesticated einkorn wheat. The agricultural revolution, the moment humans first manipulated crops, literally started in the shadow of this specific site.
The timing is incredible.
But here's the kicker. Göbekli Tepe isn't just a primitive farm. It is a massive, impossibly complex megalithic structure.
It is staggering in its complexity, and it completely defies mainstream historical timelines.
Describe the site for us.
The site features these massive, perfectly carved, T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them weighing up to 20 tons.
20 tons.
Yes, and they aren't just rough, jagged rocks dragged out of a quarry. They're adorned with incredibly intricate, low-relief carvings.
Carvings of what?
They depict animals, lions, scorpions, foxes, vultures, and abstract humanoid features like arms and hands wrapping around the sides of the pillars. Furthermore, archaeologists have discovered that the main enclosures are laid out forming a near-perfect equilateral triangle.
An equilateral triangle, that implies math.
It implies a deeply advanced, pre-existing understanding of mathematics and geometry that, according to standard history, simply shouldn't have existed for another 6,000 or 7,000 years.
This is where the source text brings in a brilliantly grounded analogy, and I want to spend some time on this because it completely shatters the mainstream narrative we're fed.
The Panama Canal analogy.
Yes. Think about building the Panama Canal today. You don't just wake up one morning with a bunch of shovels and guess how to build a transcontinental waterway.
No, you'd fail instantly.
To lead that project, you need a chief engineer. And that engineer has spent 15 to 25 years studying geotechnical engineering so the mountains don't slide into the water. They need advanced hydraulic engineering to design the locks.
And massive logistics.
They need massive logistical project management to coordinate tens of thousands of workers, house them, and feed them. Building something on that scale requires a massive pre-existing foundation of generational knowledge.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture at Göbekli Tepe, historians and mainstream archaeology are currently asking us to believe that thousands of primitive, nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who had never built anything larger than a skin tent, suddenly decided to build a massive stone complex.
Out of nowhere.
Right. And they supposedly did it without the invention of the wheel, without beasts of burden, and using only wooden or bone tools that have, quote-unquote, conveniently rotted away over the last 10,000 years.
The math just doesn't add up. I don't care how many guys you have. You do not carve 20-ton limestone pillars with a deer antler.
It's absurd.
And you certainly don't drag them across the hilly landscape and erect them in perfect equilateral triangles without an understanding of basic mechanics, pulleys, and the wheel. Civilization doesn't just leap from foraging berries to engineering equilateral megalithic complexes overnight.
No, it's like asking a group of kindergartners to build a nuclear reactor.
Exactly. Where did the chief engineer of Göbekli Tepe go to school? Where did this blueprint come from?
According to the religion in the Great Text, the chief engineer didn't go to school.
Right, because he had the mark.
That mastery, that advanced mathematical and architectural knowledge, was the pre-programmed mark that Cain brought with him from the Eden frequency. It was revealed knowledge, an emergency upload injected directly into the human timeline to ensure survival against the Ice Age.
And here's the wildest, most haunting part about Göbekli Tepe. They didn't just build this architectural masterpiece, use it for a few centuries, and let it slowly fall into ruin. They didn't abandon it.
They intentionally buried it.
Around 8000 BCE, right before the era when the Great Flood myths begin to pop up globally in every ancient culture, the entire site was deliberately buried. They intentionally hauled in thousands of tons of dirt, stone, and refuse, and completely painstakingly covered these 20-ton pillars.
It's baffling.
The sheer amount of labor required to bury the site is almost as mind-boggling as the labor required to build it.
Why would a thriving society deliberately bury its greatest achievement? It defies logic.
Right. What does the text say?
But the text suggests that Göbekli Tepe was the physical center of Cain-focused worship. It was the ultimate monument to the ego. It was a celebration of man's vigorous hard work, his dominance over nature, and his rebellion against the natural divine order.
So burying it wasn't an act of preservation.
No, it was a ritualistic attempt to hide or deactivate this center of power. It was as if the descendants of Cain knew that the era of the builder, the era of the unchecked ego, was reaching a dangerous, corrupt climax.
They were trying to hide it from the gods.
They were desperately trying to put the genie back in the bottle before the divine forces. The Anunnaki, the Elohim, the universe, sent the floodwaters to wipe the slate clean.
Which brings our entire sprawling journey full circle.
It really does.
We started with a metaphorical murder in a conceptual frequency called Eden, where the ego violently slew the spirit. We tracked that fragmented, desperate humanity through the massive cuneiform libraries of Sumer, seeing how history and time itself were managed and manipulated by divine councils.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We followed a displaced, newly awakened humanity into the freezing ash of the Younger Dryas impact. And finally, we ended up standing in the dirt of southeastern Turkey, looking at the buried 20-ton limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe.
And if you've stayed with us this long, you might be asking yourself the ultimate question. Why does any of this actually matter today?
Right. What's the takeaway?
Why should we care about 10,000-year-old stones, buried monuments, and radical reinterpretations of Bible verses?
Tell them.
It matters because the tension between Abel and Cain isn't just ancient history. It isn't just a story about two brothers in a field. It is the ongoing, daily friction within every single one of us.
A shepherd versus the tiller.
It is the eternal struggle between living in harmony with our environment, the shepherd, who trusts and preserves, versus our unyielding, almost pathological drive to manipulate, conquer, extract, and build the tiller.
That evolutionary friction.
That evolutionary friction that started in the ashes of the Ice Age is still the exact same driving force behind modern civilization today.
We are all carrying a little bit of the tiller's ambition. We all want to build walls, control our environment, and leave a mark. And that leaves us with one final lingering concept to mull over as we wrap up.
What's that?
We know from the archaeological record that Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. Ancient humanity tried to hide the ultimate monument to the ego deep beneath the earth. And shortly after they buried it, the myths and legends tell us the Great Flood came to wash all that corruption away.
The flood reset the board.
But if the mark of Cain wasn't a physical tattoo, if it was truly a genetic, psychological, or spiritual download of pure, ambitious, relentless survival programming, did the floodwaters actually wash it away?
Or is it still here?
Or is that exact same ancient programming still running quietly in our modern minds today, building our skyscrapers and our empires, just waiting for the next ice age to wake it fully up?
That is a terrifying thought to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the dirt beneath your feet.